This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. Whether or not you like them, tropes are an incredibly important part of fiction, and one of the most unavoidable tropes in fantasy fiction is that of the chosen one. You've all seen it before. The small-town kid leaves home for the first time and finds out that he is the prophesized hero, the only one who can both win the girl and defeat the Dark Lord. It has been done over and over again, to the point where it's garnered its own fair share of criticism, and I can see why. At its worst, the Chosen One trope is trite, predictable, and just unrealistic. I don't know about you, but I have very few prophecies happening in my everyday life. And yet, this archetype has stuck around. Chosen ones can be found in some of the oldest literature that can loosely be defined as proto-fantasy. It's an integral part of some of the most influential fantasy of the 20th century, and it continues to be used, transformed, and subverted by contemporary fiction authors. And if something has managed to hang onto our cultural consciousness for that long, I think it deserves a bit of further examination. At its most basic form, the Chosen One, the idea of there being a singular, predestined hero, can be found in almost all of our earliest myths and legends. Ancient Greece gave us the likes of Oedipus and Achilles, sons of noble blood who, through wit and battle prowess, rose to positions of leadership. You have the tales of pre-Christian Europe, like that of Beowulf and Siegfried, who are arguably part of the Chosen One archetype. And then the Bible gives us plenty to choose from, everyone from Moses to King David, these sons of a special heritage who are estranged from their families, but rise to become leaders of their people. You can even argue that Jesus Christ himself is a chosen one. And it's not difficult to see why this type of story was so prevalent. After all, you generally want your story to be about someone of significance. And especially if we're going to be hearing a story about how someone relatively insignificant became something significant, giving them some kind of a special backstory, a special heritage, is a really good way of keeping our interest in these people as they transform into heroes. There's a promise that that heroism is going to happen. Nobody wants to put in the effort to listen to or tell a tale about somebody who was born just being a regular person, who lived a completely ordinary life, and then died a perfectly ordinary death. In those early days, we told stories to teach, reinforce, and spread the ideals of our cultures, and a hero that perfectly embodied and displayed those ideals was an excellent tool of the trade. You know, actually, speaking of tools of the trade, if you would like to create a tool for your trade, you should check out this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. Using their cutting-edge design intelligence technology, you can unlock your creative potential and create a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to your unique needs. Squarespace makes it easier than ever for you to manage your audience using their email campaigns, where you can set up automated emails to build connections whilst saving time, and you can easily integrate your product into email templates. With their Acuity scheduling feature, you can book and manage appointments, accept payments, send automatic reminders, and so much more directly from your website. If you're interested in refreshing your existing brand or establishing an online presence, you should give Squarespace a try. Head on down to squarespace.com for a totally free trial, and when you're ready to launch, just go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. One prime example of these early chosen heroes is the looming figure of King Arthur. Now, as always, when we're going to be discussing the legend of King Arthur, it's important to remember that these are tales told across hundreds of years, over a span of thousands of miles, by millions of different voices. There is no one tale of King Arthur, no Arthurian canon, and next to no historicity to any of these stories. They are what we would consider fiction. But the fact that these stories transformed and were retold so much over time means it's incredibly interesting when ideas, like Arthur being the one chosen hero to save Britain, really stick around. In some versions of Arthur's origin story, his coming is literally predicted by wise men like Merlin. In the 12th century History of the Kings of Britain, Merlin explains his prophetic vision. "Woe to the red dragon, for his banishment hasteneth on. His lurking holes shall be seized by the white dragon, which signifies the Saxons whom you invited in. But the red denotes the British nation, which shall be oppressed by the white. Therefore shall its mountains be leveled as the valleys, and the rivers of the valleys shall run with blood. At last the oppressed shall prevail, and oppose the cruelty of foreigners. For a boar of Cornwall shall give his assistance, and trample their necks under his feet. He shall be celebrated in the mouths of the people, and his exploits shall be food to those that relate them." Arthur is the boar that shall save the red dragon, the British people, from the onslaught of the Saxons. Merlin even predicts Arthur's eventual fame, the tales and legends of his exploits carrying on far after his death. And while prophecies like this weren't in every Arthurian story, Arthur was always quite special, especially because of his noble blood. He is the son of Uther Pendragon, king of the Britons, born of royalty but raised in obscurity, a quiet upbringing where he could learn all the humility and wisdom required of a king without knowing his true heritage. By the 15th century, this tradition had developed to the point where young Arthur, unaware of his true heritage, proves himself to be king entirely by accident. In L'Amour d'Arthur, Thomas Malory speaks of a stone with an anvil atop it, stuck through with a great sword. Around that is written, "Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king, born of all England." It is a challenge, a promise, and even a prophecy, and many great and noble men have tried their hand at the sword with no success. It is of course Arthur who stumbles across it, looking for a weapon for his brother to use in his jousting tournament. Arthur sees the sword and draws it without thinking, and it isn't until others notice Excalibur's grandeur that they realize that this young man has just proven himself to be England's true king. Under Merlin's instruction, shaped by his noble blood, but also his humble upbringing, Arthur becomes a wise, fair, and brave king. He's able to unite England and drive out the invaders, and his kingdom prospers under his gentle leadership and the fraternity of the Knights of the Round Table. As is almost always the case in these heroic tales, Arthur embodies the traits and values that the storytellers were trying to encourage. No longer were the people of Europe looking for warrior leaders like Achilles or Beowulf. Instead, they sought peace and stability under a king like Arthur. As the tales of the Round Table expanded ever onwards, King Arthur remained a fixed point, a beacon of good Christian morality, around which the thrilling and often sordid tales of the Arthurian mythos pivoted. The Chosen One narrative has been popular through much of history because it worked. There is something incredibly comforting in the idea that your hero, your king, is not just a competent person, but a person promised by prophecy, by destiny, and maybe even by God to be the most competent person possible for that particular role. Featuring a chosen one hero is the perfect way to elevate your story beyond the mundane, to raise the stakes, and to redefine cultural values. But these stories are undeniably formulaic. By the 19th and 20th century, scholars were beginning to pick up and write about these formulas. In 1936, Lord Raglan published The Hero, a study in tradition, myth, and drama, where he outlines 22 points that these heroic narratives generally seem to follow. I'll pop the full list up on this screen right here if you want to pause and peruse, but it generally includes points like being the son of a king, a noble, or a lord, having a challenging childhood, fighting to a point of privilege, and marrying the princess. Most heroic narratives, everyone from Oedipus to Robin Hood, follow some or even most of these points. In 1949, Joseph Campbell took this a step further in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, in which he proposes that most, if not all, early myths, and indeed many of the myths that we still tell today, they all follow a singular, exact structure. He gives plenty of diagrams and graphs showing how this storyline works, but the general gist of it is: a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. While it was, and still is, very influential, I don't really agree with Campbell's hypothesis because I think it's limiting and a little bit reductive, and not every single story follows this plot, and his obsessive attempts to do so get a little bit over the top sometimes. But he was correct in assessing that a lot of these chosen one storylines are very structurally similar. But all of that we've been talking about has been myth. If the characters are a little bit thin and the storylines are predictable, that's because it's meant to be. It's archetypical storytelling. But by the 20th century, authors like George MacDonald, Andrew Lang, and of course J.R.R. Tolkien built off of the mythic storytelling of ages past to create a new form of intentionally written fantasy. The fantasy that they created was inspired by the detachment from reality, the scope and scale of those earlier stories, but it was also in a lot of ways much more grounded and much more aware and possibly critical of the tropes that it was dealing with. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has multiple characters that could generally be defined as chosen ones. We have Bilbo, of course, who was literally chosen by the Merlin figure of Gandalf, but Bilbo wasn't chosen because of prophecy, of noble blood, or any particular affinity for leadership. He was chosen because he was sneaky and clever, and, well, Gandalf thought it would be good for him to get some fresh air. Aragorn is much more of a direct chosen one character, with a lot of similarities to the character of King Arthur, and his story even follows many of those classic plot beats. But Tolkien subverts tradition in a fairly subtle way by having Aragorn be a side character. He's important to the events that occur, but he is not solely or even the centrally important person to achieving the climax of the story. Instead, in the classic chosen one protagonist role, Tolkien places Frodo Baggins, who, from the outset, really isn't special at all. He's a bit more wealthy, he's a bit more prone to adventure because of his tookish side, but he certainly doesn't have any special heritage or kingly blood. And yet, he is able to rise to the occasion in his own very special way. Even as he's overwhelmed by fear, contemplating the journey that is to come, there is a spark under the surface. There's a reason Gandalf chose him. Frodo did not tell Gandalf, but as he was speaking, a great desire to follow Bilbo flamed up in his heart. To follow Bilbo, and even perhaps to find him again. It was so strong that it overcame his fear. He could almost have run out there and then down the road without his hat, as Bilbo had done on a similar morning long ago. "My dear Frodo," exclaimed Gandalf, "hobbits really are the most amazing creatures, as I have said before. You can learn all that there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet, after 100 years, they can still surprise you at a pinch. I hardly expected to get such an answer, not even from you." But Bilbo made no mistake in choosing his heir, though he thought little of how important it would prove. Frodo is chosen precisely because, not in spite of, his unheroic nature. And this is because of when The Lord of the Rings was written and by whom. Tolkien had, unfortunately, come face to face with true evil in the world. He was in the trenches for the First World War's bloodiest conflict, the Battle of the Somme. Almost all of his childhood friends were killed in the war, and he had faced things that no man should ever have to see. And this was a new type of war, a uniquely violent, destructive, and horrific type of war, utterly removed from the imagined glorious battles of the mythic past. This was not Homeric or Arthurian warfare, where one might prove himself in the glory of the battlefield. Achilles and Robin Hood had no place in the pure violence of the First World War. Evil, Tolkien had come to recognize, could not be overcome with sheer power. It would need a different approach. The Ring and the corruption of Sauron is wickedly clever and insidious. It's not something that can be hit with a sword or besieged by an army. That is why no one at the Council of Elrond is willing to step up and try to accomplish this task. They know that they would fail. They would all fail, except for Frodo Baggins. A great dread fell on him, as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might after all never be spoken. An overwhelming longing to rest and remain at peace by Bilbo's side in Rivendell filled all his heart. At last, with an effort, he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." Elrond raised his eyes and looked at him, and Frodo felt his heart pierced by the sudden keenness of the glance. "If I understand aright all that I have heard," he said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great." While Frodo is changed unspeakably by what he undergoes, he doesn't learn the secrets of nature or encounter fabulous forces like Joseph Campbell would suggest. He doesn't turn out victorious and end up with a princess on his arm like Lord Raglan would have predicted. In fact, Frodo fails at the pivotal moment. He is taken by the ring just before he's able to destroy it. Without the intervention of greater forces in this moment, the ring would not have been destroyed. And that is actually where the true heroism of Frodo lies. In one of his letters, Tolkien explains, "It is possible for the good, even the saintly, to be subjected to a power of evil which is too great for them to overcome in themselves. In Frodo's case, the cause, not the hero, was triumphant, because, by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury, a situation was produced in which all was redressed and disaster averted. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point, and no further. Few others, possibly no others of his time, would have got so far. The other power then took over." Tolkien crafted a chosen one character who defied all previous convention, who proved that a new model for heroism was possible, necessary, and perhaps even more inspirational than the heroes of old. Because The Lord of the Rings would be the springboard for all future fantasy literature, it's unsurprising that the Chosen One trope was used very liberally in a lot of fantasy and science fiction. Stories like Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and Aragon, as well as thousands of other stories, have used the Chosen One trope in a fairly classic, but not entirely unquestioning way, proving that stories like this still hold a lot of sway. It's a classic format, and I doubt that it'll ever truly go out of style, but I think that my favorite use of tropes in post-Lord of the Rings fantasy fiction is the works that take the tropes and archetypes like the Chosen One and turn them on their heads. Of course, we have classic examples like that of Dune, in which Frank Herbert sets Paul Atreides up to be the perfect model Chosen One. He's got the noble heritage, he's an outcast, he has prophecies done about him, he wins over the princess, he is practically and literally a messiah. But Herbert uses Dune to build up those expectations and then blow them completely out of the water. In Dune Genesis, he explains his intent. Dune grows from my theory that superheroes are disastrous for humankind. Even if we find a real hero, whatever, or whoever that may be, eventually fallible mortals take over the power structures that always come into being around such a leader. Beneath the hero's facade, you will find a human being who makes human mistakes. Enormous problems arise when human mistakes are made on the grand scale available to a superhero. Following loosely in Dune's footsteps, works like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time and A Song of Ice and Fire continued to question, poke at, and humanize the Chosen One archetype, but I think one of my favorite contemporary examples of Chosen One subversion comes in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy. I'm gonna warn you now that I am going to spoil the entirety of the first Mistborn trilogy, so go ahead and skip to this timestamp if you don't want to get spoiled. Brandon Sanderson went into the Mistborn trilogy with the explicit intent to rewrite and redefine our expectations of the genre. In the introduction, he explains, I was able to provide a fantasy that played with and rewarded prior expectations in the genre. The prophesized hero, the Dark Lord, the nature of magic and heroism. Mistborn captures some of the classic feel of fantasy, but rewards established readers in the genre with upended tropes. This upending is subtly done and doesn't fully reveal itself until the end of the third book. But just from the get-go, you can already tell he's mixing things up a little bit by the fact that the protagonist, Vin, is a girl. You may have noticed that every example I've given up until this point has been a male chosen one, and this is because most of myth and legend had male heroes, of course, but modern fantasy, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, really followed along closely, and almost all of our heroes, especially our chosen one heroes, were male. We occasionally get important female characters, and every once in a while you see a good example of a female chosen one, but for the most part, these chosen one characters are male. So Vin, just in the fact that she is a woman, is already defying expectations a bit. But from there, everything seems pretty familiar. She begins the tale as a destitute orphan fighting for survival, but she's taken off the streets by a wise mentor figure who sees something special in her. As she's trained in the way of their magic, Vin proves herself to be more and more uniquely powerful. At the same time as all of this is going on, we are introduced through diary entries to the chosen one from a very long time ago. This is a man who, according to the prophecies, was supposed to be the hero of ages. He lined up with all of the traits that the prophecy spelled out, and it was his destiny to go to the Well of Ascension and to claim the power that lives there, and then to selflessly release it back into the world, becoming, as he is destined, the hero of ages. But our hero, according to his diary entries, is having doubts. He's buckling under the pressure of being the Messiah, and it's believed that when he went to the Well of Ascension, he took in all of that power, but found himself too selfish to release it into the world. He took the power into himself and became the despotic, immortal Lord Ruler who still reigns over their world with an iron fist. Vin has been roped into a gang, as well as a religious scholar named Sazed, who are all planning on taking the Lord Ruler out, on completely overturning his empire. Now, already, this is a kind of interesting play on tropes. It's not often that you see a chosen one who they thought was the chosen one who failed. And this becomes immensely more interesting when Vin and Sazed, the religious scholar, are able to put together the fact that the person who is now the Lord Ruler isn't actually the hero who wrote out those diaries. The man who is now the Lord Ruler was the hero's servant, who became jealous and bitter and worried that the hero wasn't really the hero, so he killed him, he took the power at the Well of Ascension, and became the evil Lord Ruler. In the present day, at the end of the first novel, Vin overpowers, outsmarts, and kills the Lord Ruler. And it makes sense. She seems like she may actually be the chosen one, so it's only justice. And now, everything can go well. Except that it doesn't go well. By the time we get to the second novel, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Vin is absolutely the true hero of ages. As the prophecy specifies, she is of humble origins, she marries the prince, and she has both strength and reticence, which the leader should have. Sazed just becomes more and more convinced that Vin really is the hero of ages, and that she must go to the Well of Ascension to release its power. They're able to find it, Vin takes in the power, and she does what no one else has been able to do. She let the power go. She held the capacity to become a deity in her hands, and she gave it away, releasing it to the waiting void. The cavern immediately began to shake. Vin cried out as the flaring power within her was ripped away, soaked up greedily by the void. She screamed, her glow fading, then fell into the now empty pool, head knocking against the rocks. The cavern continued to shake, dust and chips falling from the ceiling. And then, in a moment of surreal clarity, Vin heard a single distinct sentence ringing in her mind. "I am free!" It turns out that when Vin released the power at the well, she was freeing Ruin. Ruin is one half of the deity-like forces at work in the world, held in check only by its other half, the living force of preservation. Preservation and Ruin are this yin-yang force operating in the world, constantly preventing each other from destroying the world like Ruin wants to, and preserving it as Preservation wants to. The last time someone had claimed Ruin's power, he kept it for himself and became the evil Lord Ruler, but this time, Ruin has skewed the prophecy, making everyone think that Vin is the hero of ages, putting her in a position where she would release the power back to him, because that's what you're supposed to do according to the story. If Preservation had had it its way, Vin never would have released the power, but instead she fell right into Ruin's trap. In the end, it turns out that Vin was never the hero of ages, but she still sacrifices herself to save Preservation so that the world wouldn't be completely destroyed. Instead, the religious scholar Sazed realizes that he too lines up with the prophecy, and he takes the powers of Ruin and Preservation into himself, neutralizing both of their powers and harnessing them so that instead of constantly canceling each other out, they can be used to create. He ascends to godhood, the true hero of ages at last. At the heart of Mistborn lies expectations and assumptions. Brandon Sanderson uses what we know and what we expect from fantasy literature to manipulate us. The only reason that we expect Vin to be the hero of ages, the reason that we go along with it for so long, is because this is what 1,000 of other stories that we've read have done. Vin is the scrappy protagonist with unique and special powers who falls in line with the prophecy and must struggle with her fate in order to become the hero that we know she can be. And then Sazed, of course, falls into the wise mentor trope. He could never be the hero, because wise mentors are a different archetype to the chosen one. The reason that Mistborn works is because it is so clearly in conversation with the archetypes and tropes that have come before it. It plays on our expectations and our assumptions to create something truly subversive in its own special way. Now, it is important to note that tropes aren't real. They're not real life. They are something that we invented. And the way that we use these very inhuman tropes is incredibly telling. Do we use it to deify our heroes, to set them apart, to provide divine comfort to those hearing these familiar tales? Do we reshape these tropes into something more realistic, into a more true, more human version of heroism? Or do we use tropes to question the very nature of archetype and our seemingly unending trust in the predictability of narrative? I think that tropes, especially character tropes and archetypes, are an inherently inhuman thing. In Terry Pratchett's Witches Abroad, he confronts this idea head-on as we encounter a town being run by a fairy godmother. And this fairy godmother wants everything to play out like a story. The stepsisters must be wicked, the prince must be charming, Cinderella must want to go to the ball. But Pratchett pulls back the veil and reveals just how miserable these archetypes make people. Maybe you don't want to be wicked or charming. Maybe you don't want to go to the ball. It is up to the unlikely hero, Granny Weatherwax, to prove that humans deserve more than to be placed and forced into stories. She hated everything that predestined people, that fooled them, that made them slightly less than human. You shouldn't turn the world into stories. You shouldn't treat people like they was characters, like they was things. The chosen one trope is potent, because we are trained to look for these chosen one characters in literature, to believe in them, to create them. And there is always a bit of a chance that that means that in real life, we are going to expect chosen ones. We may even create them, and that can be a very dangerous thing. Stories are a lot of things. They're entertainment, they're art, they're education, but they do also shape the way that we take in and the way that we interact with the world around us. Tropes such as the chosen one can be whatever we make them. They could just be bad writing, they could be boring and predictable, they could also be harmful, they can cause us to dehumanize people, to put them on a pedestal so high up that they will inevitably fall off, but they can also be helpful. They can allow us to dive deeper into the differences between narrative and reality. They can cause us to remodel and rediscover what heroism truly means. And they can inspire us to try and be a little bit more like the chosen ones that we all so admire. I am very excited to see what you guys think about this trope in the comments. It's one of those things where a lot of people don't like it, but it's kind of unavoidable. It's in everything. So let me know what your favorite usage of this trope is and your least favorite down in the comments so we can discuss. Also, I do plan on doing more videos like this every once in a while where I discuss tropes and archetypes, so if you have any particular ones and any particular examples you want me to talk about later on, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. As always, my sources are linked in the very bottom of my description. If you want to go look any deeper into the stuff that I talked about, my Patreon is also linked in the description if you want to support me there. Okay, I need to wrap this up because I am losing my voice rapidly and it's like 35 degrees in here and my hands are freezing. But if you got this far in the video, go ahead and give it a like and consider subscribing if you want to tune in every single time I post a video. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hoppity day.